Camille Jameson stirred in her hospital bed, her body aching from the surgery she had just undergone. The sterile, bright room felt impersonal, and she shivered, feeling vulnerable in the vast space. Her eyes fluttered open, adjusting to the harsh fluorescent lights overhead, and her throat felt dry and scratchy. She needed water, but the fatigue weighing on her kept her from calling out. Instead, she lay still, listening to the soft hum of machines and the occasional distant voices from the hallway. The door creaked open, and Nurse Shannon Whitfield entered the room, her expression indifferent as she glanced down at the clipboard in her hands. Without looking directly at Camille, she approached the machines beside the bed, her movements quick and efficient, but completely devoid of warmth or concern. "How are we feeling today?" Shannon asked, her tone clipped and mechanical. Camille swallowed, her mouth dry, her voice a mere whisper. "I'm managing," she said, hoping for some reassurance, some sign of care from the nurse. Shannon barely glanced at her, busying herself with the machines. "I'll check your vitals," she muttered, more to herself than to Camille. She didn't offer a smile or a comforting word, just a routine check that felt more like a chore than care. Camille shifted slightly in the bed, wincing as a sharp pain flared in her side where the surgery had been performed. She wanted to ask for help, maybe even a glass of water, but something in Shannon's demeanor made her hesitate. There was a coldness, a subtle air of dismissal that left Camille feeling even more alone. Shannon finally looked up from her clipboard, her eyes scanning Camille's body without really seeing her. "Any pain?" she asked, the question more perfunctory than genuine. "Yes," Camille replied softly. "It's a bit sharp, right here." She motioned toward her side, hoping the nurse would offer some relief. Shannon scribbled something on her clipboard, her expression unchanged. "You're on medication. It should be handling it well enough. Just press the button if you need more," she said curtly before turning back to the machines. Camille let out a small sigh, watching Shannon move around the room with clinical efficiency. She didn't feel like a patient in need of care. Instead, she felt like an afterthought, a box to be checked off on Shannon's to-do list. A few minutes later, Nurse Julia Ramirez popped her head into the room, offering a small smile. "Need anything, Shannon?" Shannon glanced over her shoulder, shaking her head. "No, just taking care of this one. She's been easy enough," Shannon said, her voice taking on a slight edge as her eyes flicked briefly toward Camille. There was something in that look, something dismissive, as if Camille didn't warrant her full attention or care. Camille frowned, her heart sinking. She didn't want to make a fuss, but the way Shannon spoke about her, like she was barely worth her time, stung. She was still weak, still processing everything, and now this added layer of discomfort and uncertainty loomed over her. As Shannon left the room, her final glance toward Camille was quick, almost as if she couldn't be bothered to spare her another thought. The door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving Camille alone with her thoughts and the growing weight of Shannon's cold treatment. She wanted to cry. She wanted to be strong. But the fatigue from her surgery weighed on her, and she didn't have the energy to confront anyone. Camille closed her eyes, trying to focus on healing, but Shannon's indifferent treatment lingered in her mind like a dark cloud she couldn't shake. The next few days passed in a blur of discomfort and mounting frustration for Camille. Nurse Shannon's visits were short and dismissive, her attitude cold and condescending. Every time Camille pressed the call button for help, Shannon's responses grew shorter, her irritation more palpable. On the third day, Camille had had enough. As Shannon entered the room to check her vitals, Camille mustered the courage to speak up. "Shannon," she began, her voice shaking slightly, "can I have some pain medication? It's been a while, and the discomfort is getting worse." Shannon didn't even look up from her clipboard. "I'll get to it when I can," she said curtly, moving to the machines without bothering to address Camille's request directly. Camille's heart sank further. She felt invisible. It wasn't just the physical pain anymore. It was the way Shannon made her feel like a burden, an inconvenience. Is there something wrong? Camille asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Shannon finally glanced at her, but the look in her eyes was anything but kind. We're busy, she said flatly. You're not the only patient here. Camille bit her lip, fighting back the urge to cry. She wasn't asking for special treatment, just basic care, but Shannon's tone made her feel like she was asking for the world. Later that afternoon, as Camille lay in bed trying to rest, she overheard Shannon speaking with another nurse just outside her room. Patients like her, Shannon was saying, her voice laced with disdain, always demanding, always thinking they deserve more than everyone else. Camille's chest tightened, her heart racing. She had heard enough. Shannon's comments weren't just dismissive, they were racist. Camille had dealt with this kind of subtle prejudice before, but in a place where she was supposed to feel safe and cared for. It hurt even more. She didn't deserve this. No one did. But what could she do? She was weak, vulnerable, and her husband, Samuel, was unreachable. He was the only one who could help, the owner of the very hospital she was in. But without him, she felt powerless. By the fourth day, Camille's frustration had reached its breaking point. Shannon had delayed her medication again, and the pain in her side was becoming unbearable. When Shannon entered the room once more, Camille spoke up, her voice steady but filled with anger. Shannon, I need to talk to you. Shannon froze, her hand on the doorknob. What is it? She asked, her tone as dismissive as ever. Camille took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. I've overheard the things you've said about me. The way you've treated me has been unacceptable. Shannon's expression barely changed, but there was a flicker of annoyance in her eyes. I'm just doing my job, she said coldly. You're a patient, and I'm your nurse. That's all there is to it. Camille felt a surge of anger rise in her chest. You've been dismissive, rude, and neglectful, she said, her voice sharper than she intended. You've made racist comments, and I've heard every word. Shannon crossed her arms, her lips curling into a thin smile. You're just imagining things, she said, her voice dripping with condescension. People like you always think they're entitled to more. Camille's heart pounded in her chest, but she refused to back down. This isn't just about me, she said, her voice firm. This is about how you treat every patient who doesn't fit your narrow view of who deserves respect. Shannon's smile faded, and for a moment there was silence. Camille held her gaze, refusing to look away, refusing to let Shannon make her feel small any longer. But Shannon wasn't done. She took a step closer to the bed, her voice lowering to a dangerous whisper. You don't scare me, she said. I don't care who you are or what you think you deserve. You're just another patient to me. Camille's breath hitched, but she didn't back down. My husband owns this hospital, she said quietly, and when he finds out how you've been treating me, you'll regret it. Shannon blinked, her eyes widening slightly, but she quickly recovered, her smile returning. Oh, sure, she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Your husband owns the hospital. That's rich. Camille's hands clenched the edges of her blanket, her anger simmering beneath the surface. You'll see, she whispered, her voice trembling with both rage and exhaustion. Shannon laughed, shaking her head. I'll be back later, she said, her tone mocking. Don't worry. I'll make sure you get all the attention you deserve. As Shannon walked out of the room, Camille's heart raced. She had finally spoken up, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. Samuel would return, and when he did, Shannon would finally face the consequences of her actions. The morning sunlight filtered through the hospital blinds, casting long shadows across the sterile room where Camille lay. She had barely slept the night before, her body weak from surgery and her mind heavy with the weight of her confrontation with Shannon. But there was a glimmer of hope now, a single thread she clung to as she waited for Samuel's return. She had sent him countless messages, each more desperate than the last. She knew he would come, but the wait was excruciating. Finally, just as she began to doze off, the door swung open. Camille's eyes fluttered open, and her breath caught in her throat as she saw him. Samuel. His tall frame filled the doorway, his face a mixture of relief and fury as he rushed to her side. "Camille," Samuel breathed, his voice thick with emotion. He knelt beside the bed, taking her hand in his fingers warm against her cool skin. "I'm so sorry. I had no idea." Tears welled in Camille's eyes as she squeezed his hand, feeling a sense of safety she hadn't felt in days. "Samuel," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "It's been awful." Samuel's face darkened, his jaw clenched as he leaned closer. "Julia told me what happened. About that nurse, Shannon. I can't believe this has been happening in my hospital." Camille took a deep breath, her voice trembling as she recounted the cruelty she had endured. "She treated me like I was nothing, Samuel. Dismissed me, neglected me. And when I told her I was your wife, she laughed. She didn't believe me." Samuel's grip tightened on her hand, his eyes blazing with fury. "She mocked you?" Camille nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "She called me entitled, said people like me always expect more than we deserve." Samuel stood abruptly, pacing the room as his anger simmered. "Unbelievable. In my hospital. She pushed me back into bed when I tried to get help," Camille added quietly, feeling the anger rise in her own chest. "She told me I wasn't going anywhere." Samuel stopped in his tracks, his fists balled at his sides. "She did what?" Camille nodded, tears filling her eyes. "I was too weak to stop her." Samuel's expression hardened, and he stormed toward the door. "She's still here, isn't she?" Camille swallowed, her heart pounding. "I think so. She doesn't know you're here." Samuel's eyes narrowed. "Well, she's about to find out." And he threw open the door, his voice booming down the hallway. "Julia!" A few moments later, Nurse Julia Ramirez appeared in the doorway, her eyes wide with concern. "Dr. Jameson, Bring Shannon here," Samuel said, his voice sharp and commanding. "Now." Julia nodded quickly and disappeared down the hallway, leaving the door slightly ajar. Camille's heart raced as she watched Samuel pace the room, his fury barely contained. She had never seen him like this, so fierce, so protective. It made her feel both safe and nervous for what was about to unfold. Minutes later, the door opened again, and Shannon Whitfield stepped into the room. Her usual smug expression faltered when she saw Samuel standing there, his eyes fixed on her with a cold, intense gaze. "Dr. Jameson," Shannon said, forcing a tight smile. "I didn't know you were back." Samuel crossed his arms, his voice low and dangerous. "I'm back, Shannon, and I've heard some very disturbing things about how you've been treating my wife." Shannon's face paled, and she glanced at Camille, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Your wife?" "And that's right," Samuel snapped, taking a step toward her. "Camille is my wife, and you've been mistreating her from the moment she arrived." Shannon's mouth opened and closed as she tried to find words, her usual bravado crumbling under the weight of Samuel's anger. I didn't know." "Oh, you knew," Samuel cut her off, his voice rising. "You knew exactly what you were doing. She told you who she was, and you laughed in her face. You mocked her. You neglected her care. Am I wrong?" Shannon's face flushed with panic, her hands trembling as she clutched her clipboard. "I didn't mean any harm, Dr. Jameson. I was just following protocol?" Samuel finished for her, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Is that what you're going to say? Was it protocol to dismiss her pain? Was it protocol to call her entitled?" Shannon shook her head, her eyes darting around the room as if looking for an escape. I didn't mean—" "I don't want to hear it," Samuel snapped, his patience gone. "You've been a nurse here for over 20 years, and instead of showing compassion, instead of doing your job, you've mistreated my wife, And I can only imagine how many others you've treated the same way. Shannon took a step back, her face pale. Dr. Jameson, please, get out, Samuel said, his voice low and final. You're done here. You'll be hearing from administration tomorrow. But for now, get out of my sight. Shannon stood frozen for a moment, her eyes wide with fear. Then, without another word, she turned and fled the room, the door closing softly behind her. Samuel let out a long, slow breath, his shoulders sagging with the weight of his anger. He turned back to Camille, his expression softening as he knelt beside her again, taking her hand in his. She's gone, he said quietly, his voice filled with both relief and regret. But tomorrow she'll face the consequences. Camille exhaled, the tension slowly easing from her body. Thank you, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I needed you here. Samuel leaned down, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. I'm here now, he murmured, and I promise this will never happen again. They sat together in the quiet room, the storm of the past few days finally beginning to settle. But deep down, Camille knew there was still more to come. Tomorrow, Shannon would return for the meeting with administration, and this time Camille would be there to ensure that every one of Shannon's actions was brought to light. The next morning, Camille sat in her hospital room, dressed and ready to leave. The physical pain from her surgery was still present, but the emotional weight was even heavier. Today, there was one final thing to do before she could walk out of this place. She wasn't just leaving as a patient recovering from surgery. She was leaving as a woman who had faced injustice and was ready to demand accountability. Samuel stood by her side, his expression serious but calm. He had arranged for the meeting with Shannon and the hospital administration. This would be the moment when everything Shannon had done would be laid out for all to see. Are you ready? Samuel asked gently, placing his hand on her shoulder. Camille nodded, feeling the weight of the past few days lift slightly. I am. It's time. Together they made their way to the meeting room. Camille could feel the eyes of the staff on her as they walked down the hallway. But for the first time since she had arrived, she didn't feel small. She didn't feel like a victim anymore. She felt strong. When they entered the meeting room, Shannon was already there, seated at the long conference table, looking nervous and unsure. Her usual smugness was gone, replaced by a look of dread as she realized the gravity of her situation. Dr. Morrison, the hospital's head administrator, sat across from Shannon, flipping through papers with a calm, composed expression. Julia Ramirez was also in the room, sitting quietly on the side, ready to provide any additional testimony if needed. Camille and Samuel took their seats across from Shannon. For a moment, the room was filled with tense silence, the air thick with anticipation. Thank you all for being here, Dr. Morrison began, her voice professional and neutral. We are here today to address the serious allegations regarding Nurse Shannon Whitfield's treatment of Mrs. Camille Jameson during her stay at this hospital. Camille, would you like to begin? Camille took a deep breath, glancing at Samuel, who gave her a reassuring nod. She turned her attention to Shannon, who was visibly fidgeting, her hands clasped nervously in her lap. I want to tell you all what happened, Camille began, her voice calm but laced with emotion. From the moment I was admitted to this hospital, Nurse Shannon made it clear that she didn't think I was worth her time or care. Camille's voice grew firmer as she recounted the moments of Shannon's cruelty, the dismissive comments, the neglect, the mocking laughter when Camille revealed who her husband was. She spoke of the racism, the way Shannon had treated her as less than human because of the color of her skin. By the time she was finished, the room was silent. Shannon sat pale and trembling, her usual confidence shattered. Dr. Morrison turned to Shannon, her expression serious. Nurse Whitfield, the allegations against you are serious and deeply troubling. This hospital has zero tolerance for the kind of behavior you have displayed. Shannon opened her mouth to speak, but Dr. Morrison held up a hand. For now, you are placed on immediate leave, effective today. A full investigation will follow, and based on the testimony we've heard, I fully expect it will result in your termination. Shannon stood slowly, her face pale and her eyes wide with disbelief. She gathered her things, not daring to look at Camille or Samuel as she hurried out of the room. The door clicked shut, and with it, the weight on Camille's chest began to lift. It was over. A week had passed since Camille returned home from the hospital. She lay comfortably in bed, propped up by pillows as the sunlight streamed through the window. Her body was still healing, but emotionally she was in a much better place. Samuel entered the room, carrying a tray with breakfast. He set it down beside her, his expression light but serious. "You seem unusually happy this morning," Camille remarked, a soft smile tugging at her lips. Samuel chuckled, sitting beside her on the bed. "I have good news," he said, his eyes twinkling with satisfaction. Camille raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Tell me." Samuel took a deep breath. "It's done. Shannon has been officially fired." Camille exhaled slowly, the relief flooding through her. "So it's really over." Samuel nodded. "It's over. The investigation was thorough, and the hospital backed the decision. Shannon can't come back, and there's no way she can fight it." Camille smiled softly, feeling the weight of the past few weeks lift completely. Justice had been served, and the nightmare was finally over. But Samuel wasn't done. His expression softened even more. "There's more," he said, his smile widening. "Julia has been promoted. She's the new head nurse of her department." Camille's heart swelled with pride. "Julia? That's wonderful. She deserves it." "She does," Samuel agreed. "She made sure you were safe, and now she's being recognized for it." Camille leaned back against the pillows, her heart full of gratitude and peace. The ordeal was over, and justice had been done, not just for her, but for those who had supported her along the way. With Samuel by her side, she knew she could finally begin to heal, both physically and emotionally. The storm had passed, and now the future looked brighter than ever. Camille's recovery had begun to feel less like an uphill battle and more like a steady climb. With each passing day, her body grew stronger, and so did her resolve. Samuel remained at her side, attentive and loving, making sure that she had everything she needed. The sunlight filtering through the curtains of their bedroom gave her a sense of warmth and peace, something she hadn't felt during those cold, sterile days in the hospital. One afternoon, as Camille sat up in bed, gently stretching her limbs, she realized something. The physical pain was fading, but the emotional scars were deeper. Shannon's cruelty still lingered in her mind, like a shadow she couldn't quite shake. And even though justice had been served and Shannon had been fired, Camille knew that her journey wasn't complete. Samuel walked into the room with a cup of tea, his expression soft and warm. He set the cup down on the nightstand and sat beside her on the bed. "How are you feeling today?" he asked, gently stroking her hand. "Better," Camille replied with a small smile. "Physically, at least." Samuel nodded, his eyes filled with understanding. "Emotionally, it takes time." Camille took a deep breath, her brow furrowing slightly as she thought about the days ahead. "Samuel, I don't want what happened to me to be forgotten. Shannon was just one person, but I know she wasn't the only one. There are probably other patients who've been treated the same way, and I can't let that continue." Samuel looked at her, admiration in his eyes. "You want to make sure no one else goes through what you did." Camille nodded. "Exactly. I don't want Shannon's firing to be the end of the story. I want it to be the beginning of something bigger, a change in how people like me are treated, especially in places like hospitals. People shouldn't have to fight for dignity when they're already at their most vulnerable." Samuel smiled, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. "That's the woman I married, strong, determined, and always thinking of others." Camille chuckled softly. but there was a seriousness in her voice when she spoke again. I want to help make changes at the hospital, not just for myself, but for everyone. And I want your support. You'll always have my support, Samuel replied without hesitation. We'll make sure your voice is heard. 2 weeks after Camille's return home, Samuel arranged a meeting with Dr. Morrison and the hospital's administration. Camille had expressed her desire to be involved in discussions about improving patient care, particularly for those who, like her, had faced bias or mistreatment. As Camille entered the hospital's conference room, a wave of emotion washed over her. The sterile environment still reminded her of those painful days under Shannon's care. But now things were different. She wasn't here as a patient. She was here as an advocate, someone determined to make a difference. Dr. Morrison greeted her warmly, her expression sincere. Mrs. Jameson, thank you for coming. We're glad to have you here. Camille nodded, her gaze steady. Thank you for having me. I want to make sure that what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else. They all sat down around the long conference table, and Samuel, sitting beside Camille, gave her a reassuring nod. Camille took a deep breath and began to speak. I know that the hospital has already taken action by firing Shannon, Camille said, her voice clear and strong. But that's not enough. There needs to be systemic change. There need to be policies in place to ensure that every patient is treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their background, skin color, or status. Dr. Morrison listened attentively, nodding in agreement. We're committed to making those changes, Mrs. Jameson. Your experience has highlighted some serious gaps in our training and protocols. We're planning to implement mandatory cultural sensitivity training for all staff, as well as new procedures for reporting bias and discrimination. Camille felt a sense of relief wash over her, but she wasn't finished. That's a good start, but I think it's important that patients have a voice in this process too. I'd like to create a patient advocacy group, something that allows people to share their experiences and have a say in how the hospital operates. People should feel safe here, not afraid to speak up. Dr. Morrison smiled, clearly impressed. I think that's a brilliant idea, and I fully support it. We'll work with you to set it up, and I'll personally oversee the development of these new initiatives. Your insight will be invaluable as we move forward. Camille smiled, feeling empowered. For the first time since her ordeal began, she felt like she had taken control. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was an advocate for change. Over the next few weeks, Camille worked closely with Dr. Morrison and the hospital administration to lay the groundwork for the patient advocacy group. She met with patients who had faced similar experiences, listening to their stories and gathering feedback on how the hospital could improve. The advocacy group began to take shape, its mission clear, to ensure that every patient's voice was heard and that no one was ever mistreated or ignored because of their race, gender, or background. Camille also worked with Julia, who had fully embraced her new role as head nurse. Together, they led workshops for hospital staff, teaching them not only about the importance of cultural sensitivity, but also about the impact of bias, both overt and subtle, on patient care. In one of the workshops, Julia stood in front of the staff, her voice steady and confident. It's easy to overlook how our own biases can affect the way we treat patients. But what we might see as a small comment or action can have a huge impact on someone's experience. We need to be conscious of how we speak to and care for everyone who walks through these doors. Camille watched from the back of the room, her heart swelling with pride. Julia's leadership was exactly what the hospital needed, and seeing how the staff responded, attentive and engaged, gave Camille hope for the future. After the workshop, Julia approached Camille, her face glowing with excitement. This is working, she said, her voice filled with enthusiasm. People are really starting to understand. Camille smiled, feeling a sense of accomplishment. I knew you were the right person for the job. You're making a real difference here. Julia blushed slightly, but her smile widened. I couldn't have done it without you. You're the one who stood up and made this possible. Camille shook her head. We did it together. As the weeks turned into months, Camille's advocacy work at the hospital grew. She became a respected voice within the institution, her efforts helping to create a more inclusive and compassionate environment. Patients now had a platform to share their experiences, and staff were held accountable for their actions. But beyond the hospital, Camille felt a calling to do more. She began speaking at community events, sharing her story and encouraging others to speak up when they faced injustice. Her voice became a beacon for those who had felt powerless, and her message was clear. Everyone deserves to be treated with dignity, no matter who they are. One evening, as she and Samuel sat on the porch of their home, watching the sunset, Camille turned to him with a thoughtful expression. I never thought that what happened to me would lead to this, she said softly, but now I feel like I've found my purpose. Samuel smiled, his hand resting on hers. You've always had a purpose, Camille. It just took this experience to show you how powerful your voice really is. Camille leaned into him, feeling a sense of peace and fulfillment she hadn't known before. I'm going to keep going. I want to help more people, not just here, but everywhere. And I'll be right beside you, Samuel said, his voice filled with love and pride. As they sat together, watching the sky turn shades of pink and gold, Camille knew that her journey was far from over. There were still battles to fight, still voices to lift, and still changes to be made. But she wasn't afraid. She was stronger than ever before, and with Samuel by her side and a new sense of purpose guiding her, she was ready to face whatever came next. As Camille's advocacy work within the hospital gained momentum, she began receiving invitations to speak at conferences and community events across the city. Her story had resonated with many, people who had faced injustice, who had been silenced or overlooked in moments of vulnerability. Camille's voice, calm but strong, had become a rallying call for those who sought to challenge the status quo. One such event took place at a local community center. It was a packed auditorium filled with a diverse audience, many of whom had come to hear Camille speak about her experiences and the need for systemic change in healthcare. As Camille stood at the podium, looking out at the sea of faces, she felt a sense of responsibility but also pride. She had come so far from the scared, vulnerable woman who had been trapped in that hospital bed. Now she was empowered, ready to share her truth. Good evening, Camille began, her voice steady as the audience quieted. I'm here today not just to talk about what happened to me, but to talk about what's happening to so many others. My story isn't unique. I wish it were. But the truth is, people all over this country, people of color, people from marginalized communities, are still fighting for the basic dignity that should be a given. The room was silent, but the energy was palpable. Camille could feel the weight of her words settling over the crowd, and she continued. When I was in that hospital, I was treated not as a patient, but as a burden. I was mocked, dismissed, and neglected because of the color of my skin. And it wasn't just about me. This happens to countless others every day. And it's not just in healthcare. It's in our schools, our workplaces, our legal system. We are made to feel like we are less than, like we don't belong, but we do. We deserve to be seen, heard, and respected. A murmur of agreement rippled through the audience, and Camille felt her heart swell. She wasn't alone in this fight. Her voice had found resonance, and now it was time to harness that momentum for change. After the event, Camille was approached by a small group of community leaders, activists, educators, and healthcare workers who were eager to join forces with her. Among them was an energetic woman named Dr. Lydia Foster, a well-known advocate for healthcare reform who had spent years fighting for equity in medical treatment for underserved populations. Camille, Lydia said, her eyes gleaming with excitement. "I've been following your story, and I think we have the potential to do something big. We've needed a voice like yours, someone who's experienced this injustice firsthand, but who's also willing to stand up and say no more." Camille smiled, feeling both humbled and invigorated. "Thank you, Dr. Foster. I've been thinking a lot about how to take this beyond the hospital. I want to do more, but I don't know where to start." Lydia nodded thoughtfully. "I have an idea. What if we work together to create a coalition, a group that focuses on tackling healthcare disparities on a broader scale, not just within individual hospitals, but within the entire system? We can involve policymakers, medical professionals, and the community." Camille's mind raced with possibilities. A coalition, something that could bring lasting change on a larger scale, something that could prevent what happened to her from happening to others. It was exactly what she had been looking for. "I'm in," Camille said without hesitation. "Let's do it." Within a few short months, the Coalition for Justice in Healthcare, CJH, was born. Camille and Lydia, along with a growing team of dedicated activists and professionals, worked tirelessly to build a platform that addressed the root causes of healthcare inequality. The coalition's mission was clear: to advocate for equitable care, to fight against racial and socioeconomic biases in the medical system, and to empower patients to know their rights. The work was exhausting but rewarding. Camille spent long hours in meetings, drafting policy proposals, organizing events, and speaking to the media. She was becoming a public figure, and with that came both praise and scrutiny. One evening after a particularly intense day of meetings, Camille sat down with Samuel in their living room, feeling a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. "I didn't expect things to move this fast," Camille admitted, sipping from a cup of herbal tea. "We're getting so much attention, and it feels like there's real momentum. But sometimes it's overwhelming." Samuel reached for her hand, his touch grounding her. "You're doing amazing work, Camille, but you don't have to do it all at once. You've built something incredible with CJH, and now it's about keeping that momentum while taking care of yourself too." Camille smiled, grateful for Samuel's unwavering support. "I know. I don't want to let anyone down." "You won't," Samuel said firmly. "You're changing lives, and I'm here to remind you to take breaks when you need them." Camille chuckled softly. "I don't know what I'd do without you." As CJH grew, so did the challenges. Camille began receiving pushback from some of the more entrenched forces within the healthcare system. Certain hospitals and organizations were resistant to change, unwilling to acknowledge the racial biases that existed within their institutions. There were even moments when Camille was criticized in the media, labeled as divisive by those who didn't want to confront the uncomfortable truths about racism in healthcare. One particularly difficult meeting took place at a prestigious hospital, where Camille and Lydia were scheduled to present their findings on racial disparities in patient treatment. As Camille stood before the board, she could feel the tension in the room. The board members, mostly older, white men, looked skeptical, their expressions guarded. "This is not about blaming individual," Camille said calmly, addressing the board. "This is about addressing a systemic issue that affects millions of people. If we can work together to identify these biases and correct them, we can create a better, more equitable system for everyone." One of the board members, a man with a stern face and neatly combed gray hair, leaned forward. "Ms. Jameson, I appreciate your passion, but we've been running this hospital for decades. We have policies in place to ensure that all patients are treated equally. I'm not sure what you're suggesting here." Camille held his gaze, refusing to be intimidated. "What I'm suggesting is that your policies aren't enough. Racial bias isn't always overt, but it's there. It's in the way pain is managed for patients of color, the assumptions doctors make, and the way care is prioritized. It's time to stop pretending this doesn't exist." Lydia chimed in, backing Camille up with data and case studies. But it was clear that not everyone in the room was convinced. Still, Camille wasn't deterred. Change, she knew, would take time, and there would be resistance, but she was ready to fight for it. Despite the challenges, CJH continued to gain traction. The coalition expanded its reach, partnering with organizations across the country, from healthcare reform groups to civil rights organizations. Camille's story became a focal point in national conversations about healthcare inequality, and she was invited to testify before Congress about the need for policy reforms. As Camille stood in the grand halls of Congress, preparing to give her testimony, she felt a surge of nerves. But she reminded herself of why she was there. For every person who had been mistreated, for every patient who had felt invisible. This was her chance to make a real difference, and she wasn't going to let fear hold her back. When it was her turn to speak, Camille's voice was clear and unwavering. Too many people in this country are suffering because of a system that was not built to protect them. It's time to face the reality that racial and socioeconomic biases exist in healthcare, and they are costing lives. We need accountability, transparency, and most importantly, we need to rebuild trust between healthcare providers and the communities they serve. This is not a matter of politics. It's a matter of human dignity. As Camille's words echoed through the chamber, she knew that this was just the beginning. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but she was ready to continue the fight for justice, for equality, and for a future where no one was treated as less than human. As Camille's leadership within the Coalition for Justice in Healthcare, CJH, continued to expand, the weight of her responsibilities became heavier. The demands on her time grew as the organization gained national attention. More hospitals, community leaders, and even policymakers wanted to meet with her, while patients from all over the country began sharing their own stories of mistreatment, hoping for her guidance. Despite the incredible progress, Camille couldn't shake the feeling that the burden was becoming too much. Every day seemed to bring a new challenge. Another hospital administrator pushing back against the coalition's proposals, another media interview where her words were scrutinized, or another late-night meeting strategizing with her team. And while she was proud of what they were building, the constant pressure was beginning to take a toll on her well-being. One evening, after a particularly grueling day filled with back-to-back meetings, Camille found herself sitting alone in her office, staring at her laptop. A draft of the coalition's next policy proposal glowed on the screen, but she couldn't bring herself to focus. She rubbed her temples, feeling a familiar tension building behind her eyes. Her phone buzzed and she saw a message from Samuel. "Don't forget to breathe. I'm here when you need me." Camille smiled, feeling a wave of affection for her husband. Samuel had been her rock throughout this entire journey, always reminding her to take care of herself, even when she felt overwhelmed by the weight of her mission. But despite his support, she couldn't shake the nagging thought that she was on the verge of burning out. Later that evening, as Camille and Samuel sat on the couch together, Samuel gently broached the subject. "Camille, I've been watching you push yourself harder and harder lately. You've done amazing things with CJH, but you need to take care of yourself too." Camille sighed, leaning her head on his shoulder. "I know, Sam, but how can I slow down when there's so much work left to do? Every day I get more emails from people needing help, from hospitals resisting change. And with the media following every move I make, I can't afford to let up." Samuel stroked her hair softly, his voice calm. "I get it, and I'm so proud of what you're doing. But you can't help others if you don't take care of yourself first. Let the team shoulder some of the load. You've built something incredible, and you don't have to do it all alone." Camille closed her eyes, feeling a mixture of exhaustion and gratitude. Samuel was right. She had an incredible team of people who believed in the mission as much as she did. It was time to trust them more, to let them take the lead on some of the day-to-day work so she could recharge and focus on the bigger picture. The next morning, Camille gathered her team at the CJH office for a meeting. As they sat around the table, she could see the passion and commitment in each of their faces. These were people who had dedicated themselves to the coalition's mission, many of whom had experienced injustice in the healthcare system themselves. I want to start by saying how grateful I am for all of you, Camille began, her voice filled with sincerity. This coalition wouldn't be where it is today without your hard work. But I've realized that I've been taking on too much, and I need to lean on you all more. There was a brief silence as the team processed her words. Lydia Foster, who had been with Camille from the start, nodded in understanding. Camille, we've got your back. You don't have to do everything yourself. Camille smiled, feeling a weight lift off her shoulders. Thank you. I know I've been driving us hard, but I trust each of you to step up and lead in your areas. We're in this together. Over the next few weeks, Camille began to delegate more responsibilities to her team. Lydia took the lead on expanding CJH partnerships with other healthcare organizations, while another team member, Michael, focused on policy advocacy at the state level. Camille still played a key role in shaping the coalition's strategy, but she allowed herself to step back from the relentless grind of daily operations. The change was liberating. Camille found herself with more mental space to think about the long-term vision for CJH, and she began to feel a renewed sense of energy. The coalition continued to thrive under the team's collective leadership, and Camille realized that sharing the load had only made the organization stronger. As CJH's influence grew, so did the resistance from more entrenched forces within the healthcare industry. While some hospitals and healthcare providers were eager to collaborate and embrace the coalition's recommendations, others saw CJH as a threat. They accused Camille and her team of trying to disrupt the system and pushing an agenda that was unrealistic or divisive. One day, Camille received an email from a prominent hospital administrator who had been vocal in his opposition to CJH. His message was scathing, accusing Camille of creating unnecessary division within the healthcare community and implying that her efforts were politically motivated. Camille sat at her desk, reading the email with a growing sense of frustration. She knew that resistance was part of the fight, but the accusations still stung. All she wanted was to make healthcare fairer, more just for everyone. Yet there were still people who refused to acknowledge the biases that harm patients of color and those from marginalized communities. She forwarded the email to Lydia, who responded quickly. We expected this pushback. Stay the course. This is their way of trying to scare us into backing down, but we're not going anywhere. Camille nodded, feeling her determination strengthen. This wasn't just about one administrator's opinion. It was about the systemic change they were fighting for. She and her team had come too far to let opposition stop them now. Amid the challenges, Camille began to forge deeper relationships with key allies. One of the most important partnerships CJH formed was with the National Alliance for Healthcare Equity, NNHE, a nonprofit organization dedicated to addressing healthcare disparities across the country. The president of NARHE, Dr. Annika Hayes, was an experienced advocate who had been fighting for healthcare reform for over 2 decades. At their first meeting, Dr. Hayes greeted Camille with a warm smile. I've been watching your work, Camille, and I have to say, it's inspiring. You've built something real with CJH, and I think we can do great things together. Camille felt a deep sense of respect for Dr. Hayes, whose work had paved the way for much of the progress CJH was now building on. Thank you, Dr. Hayes. I'm honored to work with you. I think there's a lot we can accomplish if we combine forces. Together, CJH and NACH began working on joint initiatives to address healthcare inequalities on a national scale. They developed educational programs for medical professionals, created advocacy campaigns to push for legislative reforms, and organized town hall meetings to bring communities together to discuss their healthcare experiences. The partnership proved to be a turning point for CJH. With Nahechi's resources and experience, they were able to expand their reach and influence, making even more of an impact in the fight for equitable healthcare. While CJH continued to flourish, the personal toll on Camille was undeniable. Despite delegating more and leaning on her team, she found that the emotional weight of the work was still immense. Every story she heard from patients who had been mistreated, every example of injustice, added to the burden she carried. One night, Camille lay in bed next to Samuel, unable to sleep. She stared at the ceiling, her mind racing with thoughts of all the people who still needed help, all the battles still left to fight. "Sam," she whispered, turning toward him, "do you ever feel like it's too much? Like no matter how hard we try, there's always going to be more injustice to fight?" Samuel turned to her, his expression soft but serious. "I think about it all the time, but the way I see it, every step forward is a victory. We might not be able to fix everything, but every person we help, every system we change, matters." Camille sighed, feeling a mixture of gratitude and sadness. "I just don't want to let anyone down." "You're not," Samuel said gently. "You're doing everything you can, and that's enough. You don't have to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders." Camille nodded, her heart heavy but comforted by Samuel's words. She knew he was right. She couldn't do it all, but she also knew she wasn't alone. With her team, her allies, and Samuel by her side, she could keep moving forward one step at a time.